Hey, what's good everyone? My name's Awe, welcome back to my channel. So, this past week, I guess it was last week now, I spent it reading Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, and I've come to believe that it's probably the most comprehensive book on racial relations here in the US and also around the world, but primarily here in the US that I've ever read, and I'm here to convince you to go and read it and to share with other people so that we can really start making change in this country and the way that we experience just what we experience. It is really good at what it does. Really, what Caste does is it reframes how we think about race, and brings in this new language that we should use instead of race, and it's this caste system. It talks about how we uphold casteism here in this country, and it also talks about how we dismantle it. Isabel Wilkerson, she builds a really strong argument for why we should use this language instead of the more normalized and often polarized language that is calling someone a racist or saying this or that is racism. And so without further ado, I think we should just jump right in. So, racism versus casteism. So the book itself is broken up into, I think, 7 or 8 main parts. I'll show them on the screen right now. But I'm only going to talk about the most poignant parts, and I'll say you go read the rest. But I'm going to talk about the most important parts to me, and I'll start with the biggest heavy hitter for me. So race is, I think one of the biggest points that Isabel Wilkerson makes is that race simply isn't a sufficient enough term. It's not an accurate term to describe the systemic oppression of Black folks here in America. Instead, she argues that the system that we experience and we live is more akin to a caste system, which she defines as, and I'm going to put the text down here, as granting or withholding respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. The key part here is this treatment based on someone's perceived rank in a given hierarchy, being treated a certain way based on how others perceive you in this hierarchy that we all experience. What she's saying here is that the caste system is rigid and fixed, and we all know it, we all understand it, and we subconsciously abide by it. The tricky thing, and really the confusion, comes in when we start comparing that to racism. Race in itself is fluid, and over time, racism, calling someone a racist, has become a loaded term that we define as the systemic the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. This right here describes the existence of a systemic power dynamic that gets lost, especially when we start labeling individuals as racists. White people often claim to not be racist while committing stuff like microaggressions that people of color, Black folks, immigrants, we experience it. And white folks, I'm using that generically, white folks, those in the dominant caste, often justify it with stuff like, well, I have Black friends, or I'm not a racist, I voted for Obama, we've all seen Get Out. It's I voted Obama. Anyway, instead, we should describe this system that we're upholding as casteism. Whether we like it or not, this power imbalance that we feel exists, and we all feel it. When I'm the only Black person or person of color in a room, I know it, and I immediately feel that imbalance. There's this internal fight, that always happens. You enter a room, you step in there, and you immediately recognize your position, your standing, my perceived standing in that room. I've already placed myself somewhere, and I'm already fighting to prove that I belong. This imposter syndrome that is justified by, again, the system that we all experience. The fact that I have to do that, the fact that I have to feel that way or feel that I have to do that is the caste system at work. I wonder how many of you have felt that, whether you are a person of color or Black person, or even if you are a white person, when there's only one Black person in the room, we know that and you recognize it. And the sucky thing about that is that those in the dominant caste also uphold that system too. This leads to my second sort of big takeaway from the book, was that Isabel Wilkerson used this term, this sort of term, I'm sort of using it here and there, of dominant caste versus lower caste, instead of people's races outright to describe the imbalance. Funny enough, every time she mentions, someone from the dominant caste treated someone from the lower caste this way or treated me this way, I immediately filled the blank in my head of what that person looks like. And I think that sort of goes to show that it goes one way but not the other. Okay, so next I'd like to talk about a couple pillars or a couple aspects of caste that really stood out to me. Like I said earlier, Wilkerson breaks up the book into 7 or 8 different parts in total, with one of those parts being the 8 pillars of caste. And they're on the screen right now, and we could spend all day talking. This would be a much longer video. We could spend all day talking about each of these pillars, but the one I want to sort of share a little bit about is the pillar of occupational hierarchy, which says that caste systems rest upon a bottom tier which performs menial tasks whose labor supports other castes. And so basically what it's trying to say here is that some castes belong doing certain, lower castes, the bottom castes, belong doing a certain class of work, and that class of work generally supports the upper class, or those in the dominant castes. I hope that sort of makes sense, and if you want, either go read the book or you can look up sort of what this means. So what this is saying, it's saying that it's inscribing those in different castes to the different jobs that they do. Again, sort of building the system of perceived hierarchy. Bottom castes do this kind of job. Dominant castes do this kind of job. For example, in my undergrad, we fought against the implementation of a private police force, especially a private police force on our campus, especially not just out of fear of what this could mean for the community, the Baltimore community, the relationships between my undergrad and the Baltimore community, but also out of fear of what this could mean for the Black students, the students of color on campus. Students are routinely stopped and asked for their J cards, our little ID cards, to prove that we're students. We've seen tons of news reports that I think there was a student at Yale who she was sleeping in her dorm room or in her common room, and the police came and said oh, ma'am, you're not allowed to be here, and she's I literally live here, I'm sleeping in my common room, I belong here. The police had to come and ask her to prove it and whatnot. This sort of stuff isn't just stories out of nowhere or once in a blue moon type of things. These are real experiences that we feel. These are experiences that I feel, and I constantly have to think about how I show myself off in society, especially when I'm on campus, to not draw any additional suspicion to me in any way. The occupation here, the occupation that's in question, is our perceived rank in society. Again, do we belong? Does a person who looks like me, are they a student? That's the occupation. Does a person who look like me belong here? Belong in this room? If you were to look in, again, if I was the only person of color or Black person in a room, and I'm the only one, you would think, if you'd say which one of these things doesn't fit? Of course, that's the one that doesn't fit because it's the one that's different. Anyway. Our occupation is questioned based on our occupation, which is our role as students, is questioned based on this perceived rank we have in society. Another section of the book talked about how caste affects those within it. The point that stood out here was the idea of the bottom caste as a scapegoat. And this idea blamed the failings in society on bottom caste members. For example, blaming crime on African Americans. We see this play out often with coded language, sometimes overt, but often coded language, using language oh, this town used to be so good. Back in my day, things used to be so good. Or calling places like the hood, the ghetto, or phrases like black on black crime to describe the shortcomings an urban area experiences. This is an especially interesting phenomena as a Ghanaian American, and where my family and often other folks from who've recently immigrated to the country often saw ourselves distinct from Black Americans or tried to separate ourselves from Black Americans. But it's funny because the world sees us all as Black, and so they're inscribing this on us, but there is that difference that exists. And again, it just continuously blows my mind that this idea, because like there was another part of the book that even said like in Africa, like when we talk about there's no such thing as black folks, because we're all just one people, like we are Ewe, we are Akan, we are Ashanti. In Nigeria, people are Yoruba, people are Igbo, like that's how we're so much more than just like the color of our skin. And here, again, our skin sort of puts us in this position in society, and we're sort of made to fulfill that societal role based on that perceived rank. Finally, this book ends on some discussion on a world without caste. To be honest, I thought that there wasn't enough on how we could dismantle the existing caste system that we live in, but I wish there was more on how we could do that. But a couple of ways that Wilkerson points out is sort of comparing the U.S. to Germany, Nazi Germany especially. We see that Germany today doesn't uphold or stand for Nazism in any way, and it condemns it at every turn. Like no statues, like if someone had a loved one who was a Nazi, like no one ever proudly says that, out of embarrassment or understanding that this truth happened. And while today we aren't the ones who committed those atrocities, it is part of our history, and it's our job to sort of, acknowledge that, but then also prevent that from ever happening again. Whereas when we look here in the US, we find that Confederate generals still have statues up, they still have dorms that are named by them, they still have streets that are still named by them, and folks will proudly claim, that their, ex-great-grandfather was a Confederate member and whatnot. And when we think about those little symbols, we think about, well, what does that say about the society that we live in? What do we value? And when we don't have a clear understanding or framing of what history looked like, or when there are multiple interpretations of what history looked like, then we get people who then uphold, who then allow, these symbols to stand. And when we let those symbols stand, in a way, we're sort of permitting these things from happening. One of my favorite quotes, in fact, it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes this is by Frederick Bachman in Beartown, and the quote says, culture is as much about what we encourage as what we permit. So what are we allowing to happen? Whether we're not actively encouraging, folks to say, pro racism, pro Confederacy, pro, this idea of this America, we might not be actively encouraging it, but what are we permitting? What are we allowing? That is part of our culture. That still defines who we are. And when we let that happen, in whether it's subtly with stuff with the voting rights, or voter suppression, that could be an overt way of pushing this on, Jim Crow sort of era type of stuff being applied on us. But then, anyway, those are a couple of my thoughts from Caste. And I hope these points were interesting enough. It definitely spurred tons of reflection on my part, but I hope they were interested enough for you to think, oh man, I really want to go read this book. So you should go check it out, read it, pass it on to someone else, tell someone else to read it, and let's really start thinking about how we can reframe the world that we live in and talk about the phenomena that we experience, how we can maybe start using the language of dominant caste versus lower caste. And think about ways that we can also try and dismantle the system, because it's really up to each individual. The caste system is only as real as those who believe in it and those who allow it to perpetuate. And so that's all. Yeah, if you read it and you want to chat, definitely hit me up. I gladly set up a Zoom, we can chat about it. A lot of this book frustrated me to no end, hearing some of the stories and some of the experiences that people in this country have experienced since its inception, literally its founding. But I think, like I said, it was cause for a lot of reflection and thinking about what that looks like today and where we can get to tomorrow. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Stay tuned. I have some really cool videos coming up. I have a really cool project that I'm working on, and I can't wait to share it with everyone. And so on that note, I'll see y'all later.